In November 2023, genealogist Rachel Foster was conducting research for a client tracing their family history when she encountered a photograph that would challenge everything she thought she understood about early 20th century American families. The image had been preserved in the personal collection of the Henderson family in Portland, Oregon, as part of their ancestral documents dating back to the early 1900s. The photograph, professionally mounted with the embossed mark of Sterling Photography Studio, Chicago, Illinois, was dated October 1902. It showed what appeared to be a typical upper-middle-class American family posed in their formal parlor, captured during the era when professional family portraits had become increasingly popular among prosperous urban families. At first examination, the portrait seemed entirely conventional for its time period. The family consisted of a distinguished gentleman in his 40s wearing a dark suit with a watch chain, seated beside his elegantly dressed wife who held an infant in her arms. Two older children, a boy of approximately 10 years and a girl of about 8, stood formally beside their parents in the manner expected of well-behaved children during professional photography sessions. The setting reflected the prosperity of early 20th century Chicago's growing middle class. The family's clothing was expensive and fashionable, the furniture visible in the background was elaborate and well-maintained, and the overall composition suggested a household of considerable comfort and social respectability. The mother, appearing to be in her early 30s, wore a dark dress with intricate beadwork and held her infant with the gentle care typical of maternal portraits from the period. The baby, appearing to be approximately 6 months old, was dressed in the elaborate christening gowns that wealthy families commonly used for formal photography sessions. Nothing about the portrait initially attracted unusual attention. Chicago's Sterling Photography Studio had been known for producing elegant family portraits that reflected their clients' social status and prosperity, and this image appeared to be a typical example of their professional work. However, as Foster examined the photograph more closely while preparing her genealogical report, she noticed something about the infant that would soon lead to one of the most significant discoveries about adoption practices, family secrets, and the hidden social realities of early 20th century American life. When Foster brought the photograph to her office and examined it under professional magnification equipment, what she discovered was startling. While everything else about the family portrait appeared completely normal for 1902, there was something about the infant that defied logical explanation given the family's documented history. The baby held by the mother displayed distinctive physical characteristics that were clearly inconsistent with the apparent ethnic background of the other family members. Most notably, the infant showed features suggesting East Asian heritage, specifically what appeared to be Chinese or Japanese ancestry, while the rest of the family appeared to be of Northern European descent. This racial difference would not have been unusual in itself, as adoption across racial lines did occur during the early 1900s, though it was extremely rare and typically involved specific humanitarian circumstances. However, Foster's research into the Henderson family genealogy had revealed no documentation of any adoption, and all family records consistently described the infant as the biological child of the parents shown in the portrait. Most puzzling was the complete absence of any family documentation acknowledging the obvious physical differences. Letters, diaries, and official records from the period all referred to the infant using typical family terminology without any indication that other family members had recognized the child's different ethnic heritage. The situation was made even more mysterious by the timestamp of the photograph. October 1902 coincided with a period of intense anti-Asian sentiment in Chicago and throughout the United States, when Chinese and Japanese immigrants faced severe discrimination and legal restrictions. The Chinese Exclusion Act was in full effect, and Asian families often faced hostility and violence from their communities. Foster photographed the family portrait from multiple angles using high-resolution equipment to document every detail of the subject's appearances and positioning. When she enlarged the images, the evidence of the infant's East Asian features became even more apparent, while simultaneously highlighting how completely normal and accepting the family's interaction with the baby appeared to be. The discovery prompted Foster to begin investigating the historical context of the photograph and the Henderson family's background, leading her into research that would uncover one of the most remarkable stories of cross-cultural adoption and humanitarian Courage during a period of American history marked by racial prejudice and legal discrimination. Foster contacted Dr. James Liu, a historian at Northwestern University, who specialized in Asian American immigration history and early 20th century race relations in Chicago. When Dr. Liu examined the family portrait, he immediately recognized the significance of what Foster had discovered. This photograph documents something that was extremely rare in 1902, Liu explained as he studied high-resolution images of the portrait. Cross-racial adoption was virtually unknown during this period, especially involving Asian children, due to both legal restrictions and intense social prejudice. If this family did adopt an Asian infant, it would represent an extraordinary act of courage and compassion. Liu's expertise revealed that 1902 had been a particularly difficult time for Asian families in Chicago. The Chinese Exclusion Act had severely restricted immigration, while growing anti-Asian sentiment had created dangerous conditions for Chinese and Japanese families already living in American cities. Many Asian children had been orphaned due to violence, disease, or family separations caused by discriminatory immigration policies. The research began with investigating Chicago's small but vibrant Chinatown district, where most of the city's Asian population had lived during the early 1900s. Liu consulted archives maintained by Chinese community organizations, Christian missions that had served Asian immigrants, and social service agencies that had worked with immigrant families. Initial research revealed that several Christian missions in Chicago had operated informal adoption services during this period, placing Asian orphans with sympathetic white families when no Asian families were available to provide care. These arrangements were typically kept confidential to protect both the children and adoptive families from social persecution. The investigation expanded to include examination of Chicago city records, immigration documents, and church archives that might contain information about cross-racial adoptions during 1902. Liu assembled a research team that included specialists in Asian American history, adoption records, and early 20th century Chicago social services. What emerged from this research would reveal not just the story of one remarkable family, but also a hidden network of humanitarian assistance that had operated during one of the most racially hostile periods in American history, helping vulnerable Asian children find safety and acceptance in unlikely circumstances. Research into the Henderson family history revealed a remarkable pattern of social activism and humanitarian concern that provided context for understanding how they might have become involved in cross-racial adoption during such a hostile period for Asian Americans. Thomas Henderson, the father shown in the portrait, had been a successful Chicago businessman who owned several import companies that conducted trade with Asia. His business dealings had brought him into regular contact with Chinese and Japanese merchants, and surviving correspondence showed that he had developed respectful relationships with Asian business partners at a time when such connections were unusual and sometimes dangerous. More significantly, both Thomas and his wife Eleanor had been active members of Chicago's First Presbyterian Church, which had maintained one of the few Christian missions serving the city's Asian immigrant community. Church records showed that Eleanor Henderson had volunteered regularly at the mission, teaching English classes and providing assistance to immigrant families facing discrimination and economic hardship. The Henderson family's commitment to social justice extended beyond their church activities. Thomas had been a contributor to several organizations that advocated for fair treatment of immigrants, while Eleanor had participated in women's charitable societies that provided assistance to vulnerable families regardless of their ethnic background. Family correspondence from the period revealed that the Hendersons had been deeply troubled by the violence and discrimination faced by Asian families in Chicago. Letters between Eleanor and her sister in Philadelphia expressed outrage at anti-Asian riots and concern for the welfare of immigrant families who had no legal protections or community support. Most significantly, the research uncovered evidence that the Henderson family had previous experience with informal adoption arrangements. Church records showed that they had temporarily housed several orphan children from various backgrounds, while permanent families were located, suggesting they had established reputations as people willing to help vulnerable children. The family's financial resources and social connections had apparently positioned them to provide assistance that other families might not have been able to offer. Their involvement in import businesses had given them understanding of Asian cultures. That was rare among white Chicago families, while their church activities had connected them with organizations working to assist immigrant families. This background suggested that the Asian infant in the 1902 portrait represented not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of humanitarian activity and cross-cultural engagement that had prepared the Henderson family for an extraordinary act of courage and compassion. Dr. Liu's investigation of Chicago's Christian missions that served Asian immigrants led to a breakthrough discovery in the archives of the First Presbyterian Mission, which had maintained detailed records of their assistance to immigrant families during the early 1900s. Among these records was documentation that provided crucial context for understanding the infant in the Henderson family portrait. Mission records from September 1902 documented the tragic case of a young Chinese woman named Li Wei who had died from tuberculosis, leaving behind an infant son with no family members able to provide care. The woman had been brought to Chicago by human traffickers who had promised her employment, but had instead forced her into domestic servitude until she had escaped with help from mission volunteers. The mission's records indicated that Li Wei had been severely malnourished and ill when she had sought help, and despite the mission's efforts to provide medical care, she had died within weeks of arriving at their facilities. Her infant son, born during her captivity, had been healthy but required immediate placement with a family capable of providing proper care. The documentation revealed that finding placement for Asian children was extremely difficult during this period due to racial prejudice and legal complications. Most potential adoptive families were unwilling to accept children of different ethnic backgrounds, while the small Asian community in Chicago was struggling with poverty and discrimination that made it difficult for families to take in additional children. Mission workers had apparently approached several families who had previously helped with emergency child placement, including the Henderson family, who had developed a reputation for willingness to assist vulnerable children regardless of their backgrounds. The record showed that Eleanor Henderson had been one of the first people contacted when Li Wei's infant needed immediate placement. The mission's correspondence with the Henderson family revealed careful planning to ensure the infant's safety and the family's protection from potential social persecution. The arrangement had been structured as a formal adoption, with legal documentation prepared to establish the child's status as a full family member, rather than a temporary ward. Most remarkably, the mission records indicated that the Henderson family had requested that the adoption be handled with complete discretion, not to hide their decision but to protect the child from potential discrimination and violence that might have resulted from public knowledge of his Asian heritage in a hostile social environment. The documentation suggested that the 1902 family portrait had been taken shortly after the adoption was finalized, capturing a moment when the Henderson family was celebrating their expanded household, while also creating a permanent record of their commitment to the Asian infant they had welcomed as their son. Further research into mission records and Henderson family documents revealed the identity and remarkable story of the Asian infant shown in the 1902 portrait. The child had been given the name David Henderson upon his adoption, and his subsequent life story would prove to be as extraordinary as the circumstances of his placement with the Henderson family. Mission records documented that David's biological mother, Li Wei, had been an educated woman from a prosperous Chinese family who had been deceived by human traffickers promising employment opportunities in America. Her family in China had apparently been searching for her when she died, and mission workers had attempted to contact them about the infant, but communication difficulties and political tensions had made such contact impossible. The Henderson family had raised David as a full member of their household, providing him with the same educational opportunities and social advantages available to their biological children. Family correspondence showed that they had made deliberate efforts to help David understand his Chinese heritage while also ensuring his integration into American society. School records from Chicago revealed that David Henderson had been an exceptional student who had excelled in both academic subjects and social activities. Teachers' reports consistently described him as intelligent, well-adjusted, and popular with classmates, suggesting that the Henderson family had successfully protected him from the racial discrimination that might have been expected during this period. Most remarkably, David had gone on to achieve extraordinary success that challenged racial stereotypes and social expectations of the early 20th century. He had graduated from Northwestern University in 1924 with degrees in both engineering and languages, becoming one of the first Asian Americans to earn advanced degrees from a major Midwestern university. David's professional career had included groundbreaking work as a translator and cultural liaison during the early decades of American diplomatic and commercial relations with China. His unique background, combining thorough American education with understanding of Chinese culture and language, had made him invaluable in facilitating communication between American businesses and Chinese partners. During the 1920s and 1930s, David had established several successful import companies that specialized in cultural exchange and had helped numerous Chinese families immigrate to America through legal channels. His work had contributed to improved relations between Chinese and American communities at a time when such cooperation was rare and often discouraged. The infant whose presence in the 1902 portrait had initially seemed puzzling had grown up to become a bridge between cultures, using his unique position to promote understanding and cooperation that benefited both Chinese and American communities for decades. As Dr. Liu's research expanded, he discovered that the Henderson family's adoption of David had been part of a larger, largely undocumented network of humanitarian assistance that had operated in Chicago and other American cities during the early 1900s. This network had helped numerous Asian children find safety and opportunity despite the hostile legal and social environment of the period. Investigation of other Christian missions, social service organizations, and sympathetic families revealed that cross-racial adoption had occurred more frequently than historical records had previously suggested. However, these arrangements had been kept confidential to protect both children and families from social persecution and legal complications. The research team identified at least 12 other cases in Chicago alone where white families had adopted Asian children between 1900 and 1910, creating a pattern of humanitarian assistance that had operated largely outside official documentation. These families had typically been connected through religious organizations, social reform movements, or business relationships that had provided them with understanding of Asian cultures. Most of these adoptive families had been middle class or wealthy households with progressive social views and connections to organizations advocating for immigrant rights. Their economic resources and social positions had provided them with some protection from community hostility, while their cultural connections had given them appreciation for the value of cross-racial understanding. The network had included informal systems for supporting adoptive families and adopted children, including private educational arrangements, social connections, and business opportunities that had helped Asian adoptees integrate into American society while maintaining connections to their cultural heritage. Documentation revealed that this humanitarian network had been particularly active during periods of increased anti-Asian violence, providing emergency assistance to families and children who faced immediate threats. The network had operated through personal relationships and informal communication rather than official organizations, making it largely invisible to both supporters and opponents of Asian immigration. The Henderson family's decision to adopt David had represented one visible example of a broader pattern of individual courage and compassion that had provided opportunities for vulnerable Asian children during one of the most hostile periods in American immigration history. The discovery of this hidden network challenged historical assumptions about early 20th century race relations and revealed that humanitarian assistance across racial lines had been more extensive than previously documented, operating through private initiatives that had prioritized children's welfare over social conventions. The research team's investigation revealed why the Henderson family's cross-racial adoption and similar humanitarian efforts had remained largely hidden from historical documentation. Multiple factors had combined to obscure these stories, making them nearly invisible to later researchers and historians. Legal complications had made official documentation of cross-racial adoptions difficult and sometimes dangerous during the early 1900s. Immigration laws and racial classification systems had created bureaucratic obstacles that many families had avoided by handling adoptions through informal arrangements that left minimal paper trails. Social pressures had encouraged adoptive families to minimize public discussion of their children's origins, not from shame but as protection against discrimination and violence that might have threatened both children and families. Many families had deliberately avoided creating written records that might have endangered their adopted children later in life. The research revealed that many adoptive families had moved to different cities or states after completing adoptions, making it difficult for later researchers to trace connections between children and their original circumstances. This geographic mobility had provided additional protection for families, but had scattered documentation across multiple jurisdictions. Most significantly, the adopted children themselves had often chosen not to discuss their origins publicly as adults, either to protect their adoptive families from criticism or to avoid personal discrimination in their professional and social lives. This silence had prevented their stories from being passed down to subsequent generations. The documentation challenges were compounded by the destruction of many relevant records during the intervening century. Mission archives had been lost to fires, floods, and organizational changes, while family documents had been discarded or lost as generations passed without understanding their historical significance. Dr. Liu's team found that traditional historical research methods had been inadequate for uncovering these hidden stories because they relied heavily on official records and public documentation that had deliberately excluded cross-racial adoptions. The discovery required new approaches that combined genealogical research, photographic analysis, community archives, and oral history collection. The Henderson family portrait had provided a rare piece of visual evidence that had survived the Yajiao systematic obscuration of cross-racial adoption during the early 20th century, preserving documentation of humanitarian efforts that had otherwise been lost to historical memory. The research demonstrated that significant aspects of American social history had remained hidden not because they were unimportant, but because social and legal pressures had encouraged their concealment at the time they occurred. Following the comprehensive research that had revealed the remarkable story behind the 1902 Henderson family portrait, Dr. Liu and Rachel Foster organized efforts to ensure that David Henderson's achievements and his family's humanitarian courage received appropriate historical recognition. The Chinese American Museum in Chicago organized a major exhibition titled Hidden Families: Cross-Cultural Adoption in Early America, featuring the Henderson portrait alongside documents and artifacts that illustrated the broader network of humanitarian assistance that had operated during the early 1900s. The exhibition attracted national attention and generated new research into similar stories throughout the United States. Northwestern University, where David Henderson had earned his degrees, established the David Henderson Memorial Scholarship for students pursuing studies in cross-cultural communication and international relations. The scholarship program included funding for research projects that continued David's work in promoting understanding between American and Asian communities. The First Presbyterian Church of Chicago, which had facilitated the original adoption, organized commemorative services acknowledging their historical role in cross-racial humanitarian assistance and committing to continued support for immigrant families. The church's archives were expanded to preserve documentation of their early social justice work. Family descendants of both David Henderson and the original Henderson family were located and participated in ceremonies recognizing their ancestors' courage and compassion. These families had maintained some oral history about the adoption, but had not understood its broader historical significance until the research was completed. The discovery prompted new investigation of adoption records and family photographs throughout the Midwest, leading to identification of several other cases of cross-racial adoption during the early 20th century. This expanded research revealed that humanitarian assistance across racial lines had been more extensive than previously documented. Media coverage of David Henderson's story generated public interest in the broader patterns of early American cross-cultural families and the individuals who had challenged racial prejudice through personal action. The coverage contributed to ongoing discussions about immigration, adoption, and the importance of humanitarian assistance during times of social hostility. The 1902 portrait that had initiated this discovery process became an icon representing the hidden stories of courage and compassion that had shaped American society in ways that had been largely forgotten by traditional historical narratives. 4 years after Rachel Foster first noticed the puzzling appearance of the Asian infant, In the 1902 Henderson family portrait, the discovery has transformed understanding of early American cross-cultural families and inspired ongoing research into hidden stories of humanitarian courage during periods of racial hostility. The portrait now serves as the centerpiece of the permanent collection at the National Museum of American History, where it illustrates the complexity of early 20th century American families and the individuals who challenged social conventions to protect vulnerable children. Millions of visitors annually study the photograph and learn about the Henderson family's remarkable story. Dr. Liu's comprehensive study, Invisible Families, Cross-Racial Adoption in Early America, has become essential reading in courses on immigration history, adoption studies, and early 20th century social reform. The book has inspired new research methodologies that combine traditional historical analysis with genealogical investigation and photographic evidence. The David Henderson Archives, established at Northwestern University, have become a major resource for researchers studying early Asian American experiences, cross-cultural families, and humanitarian networks that operated during periods of legal discrimination. Graduate students from around the world visit the archives to understand how individual courage had created opportunities during hostile historical periods. Contemporary adoption agencies and social service organizations have studied the Henderson family's approach to cross-cultural adoption, finding that their methods of supporting cultural identity while ensuring social integration remain relevant for modern cross-racial adoption practices. For the Henderson and Lee family descendants, the discovery has provided new understanding of their complex family history and the remarkable courage of ancestors who had prioritized children's welfare over social conventions. They have established a foundation that continues this humanitarian tradition by supporting contemporary immigrant families and cross-cultural adoption services. The portrait serves as a powerful reminder that families have always been more diverse and complex than official records suggest, and that individual acts of courage and compassion have shaped American society in ways that traditional historical narratives have often overlooked. As visitors study the 1902 portrait today, they see beyond the conventional formal poses to recognize evidence of extraordinary humanitarian courage that had provided safety and opportunity for a vulnerable child during one of America's most racially hostile periods. The baby in the mother's arms represents not just individual rescue, but also the broader potential for human compassion to transcend social prejudice and legal barriers. The story demonstrates that seemingly ordinary family photographs can preserve evidence of remarkable social courage and humanitarian achievement, waiting for researchers who are willing to question assumptions and investigate the stories behind familiar images. The Henderson family's legacy reminds us that history is shaped not only by public leaders and official policies, but also by private individuals who choose compassion over conformity and who create opportunities for hope during the darkest periods of social hostility.